The grand auditorium of the U.S. Naval Operations Command was packed to capacity. Row after row of crisp white uniforms and gleaming brass buttons sitting in strict formation under the high, domed lights. Photographers hovered discreetly in the corners, their long lenses aimed toward the elevated stage where valor was to be rewarded. The air was thick with the scent of polish, pride, and pageantry, a controlled atmosphere of victory that felt more like a religious service than a military ceremony. In the front row sat Admiral Marcus Thorne, a man whose stern reputation was as decorated as the uniform he wore. His chest bore an intimidating lineup of ribbons and medals, each one a silent testament to decades of blood, precision, and unwavering command. He was not a man easily impressed. He had seen heroes rise and fall, stories bloom and fade into redacted files. But today, his sharp, analytical eyes were fixed on one name listed on the program, a name he'd heard spoken in hushed, almost mythical tones throughout the Navy's most classified corridors for years, though he had never once met the person it belonged to. Lieutenant Eva Rostova. She wasn't what he or anyone else expected. When her name was finally called, there was no excited roar from the crowd, just a reverent hush that fell over the auditorium like a sudden fog. Every head turned as she stood from her seat in the third row, her movements precise, economical, and devoid of any emotion. Her back was ramrod straight, her expression a blank slate of composure. She didn't scan the crowd or bask in the moment of recognition. Instead, she marched forward as if it were just another day on base, another standard protocol to be executed flawlessly. The announcer's voice, amplified by the hall's acoustics, echoed with a carefully sanitized version of a mission that remained classified even 2 years after it had occurred. Lieutenant Rostova is awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during a covert operation in the South Pacific, he read from a prepared citation, the words feeling too small, too hollow for the immense weight she seemed to carry in her silence. Bravery, initiative, combat excellence. They were just words floating out over the audience, failing to capture the truth of what had happened. The real story circulated only in whispers among enlisted men and intelligence analysts. Rumors of a brutal ambush in a forgotten jungle, of teammates dragged from the jaws of certain death, of a lone woman who refused to be medevaced despite her own critical injuries, holding a lost position for 3 days until reinforcements arrived. Most thought the stories were exaggerated, battlefield legends spun to boost morale. Some believed she'd been protected by top brass, her file scrubbed clean for reasons no one understood. But no one, not even the most cynical officer, doubted that something unforgettable had happened to her out there. Admiral Thorne watched her climb the stage steps with a mechanical grace that was almost unsettling. Her posture was perfect, almost too perfect. It wasn't the prideful stance of a soldier eager for a medal, but the rigid discipline of someone who had spent years burying an unspeakable pain deep within their bones. She rendered a salute with practiced precision, her eyes level and jaw clenched tight. He rose from his seat and approached her on the stage. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Hers were steely blue but sunken, carrying the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. His were sharp, inquisitive, trying to read the story her file had deliberately omitted. He shook her hand firmly, the contact brief and professional, and pinned the medal against the starched fabric of her uniform. The audience erupted in applause, rising to their feet in a wave of patriotic fervor. Cameras flashed like strobing lights, but Eva barely blinked. There were no tears, no smile, just a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "Congratulations, Lieutenant," Thorne said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the din. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her own voice a near whisper, flat and devoid of warmth. He wanted to ask more, to pull her aside right there on the stage and demand to know what really happened in that jungle. He wanted to ask why she still carried that weight like a suit of armor, why her eyes looked like they had seen the end of the world and come back alone. But this wasn't the time or the place. The ceremony rolled on, other names were called, and Eva returned to her seat as though the highest honor for naval bravery was nothing more than a minor interruption to her day. But the Admiral's curiosity didn't fade. It sharpened into a pointed professional need to know. As the ceremony wrapped up, the crowd began to loosen. Officers mingled, reporters prepared their carefully worded articles, and families embraced their decorated sons and daughters. Yet Eva remained a solitary figure, exchanging a few polite but brief words, always standing alone, as if some essential part of her still resided in that classified location, forever on watch. Admiral Thorne waited, then made his way toward her through the dispersing crowd. "Lieutenant Rostova," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. She turned, saluting him again with the same rigid formality. He returned the gesture. "Walk with me." She hesitated for only a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or weariness, in her eyes, but then she fell in a step beside him. They walked out of the grand hall and down a quiet, empty corridor lined with the portraits of fallen heroes, their youthful faces frozen in time. "You refused this medal once before," Thorne stated, his voice even, a test to see how she would react. "I did, sir," she replied, her gaze fixed forward. "Why accept it now?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes trailed over the framed photographs on the wall, lingering on the faces of men and women who had never made it home to receive their honors. "I thought no one cared enough to ask why I refused," she finally said, her tone strange, not rebellious, not bitter, just exhausted. The voice of someone who had carried something too heavy for too long and had almost forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Thorne stopped walking, forcing her to face him. The official report was a lie, wasn't it? He knew how files could be sanitized, how inconvenient truths could be scrubbed away to preserve a clean narrative of victory. Eva's jaw tightened. "They don't lie, sir," she said, her voice dropping, taking on a harder edge. "They just leave things out, the important things." He watched her closely now, trying to read the story that the citations and after-action reports had failed to capture. "I authorized that mission," he admitted, his own memory of the briefing flashing in his mind. "I remember the details. Covert insertion, classified coordinates, intelligence indicated light resistance. You were leading a small recon squad to verify a target." "You remember wrong," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, a statement of fact that sent a chill down his spine. Thorne's brows furrowed. "How so?" She finally turned to face him fully, and for the first time, something raw and unguarded flickered in her gaze. "We were sent into a trap, Admiral. The intelligence wasn't just wrong, it was fabricated. We weren't supposed to come back." He was stunned by the cold conviction in her tone, the absolute certainty of a soldier who had seen the truth with her own eyes. "You think the mission was deliberately compromised?" "I don't think," she said, the words sharp as shrapnel. "I know." A long, heavy silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant, muffled hum of voices from the auditorium. Then she said something that caught him completely off guard, something that defied all protocol and decorum. "If you really want to know why I didn't want the medal, you need to see what it actually cost." Thorne's expression shifted from authoritative to confused. "What do you mean by that?" Eva stepped closer, her steely eyes locked on his. "Not just in body, sir. In bone. In blood." And before he could respond, before he could process the sheer audacity of her statement, she looked over her shoulder, nodded toward a nearby, secure briefing room, and said, "Come with me. I'll show you." The small briefing room was stark and sterile, furnished with nothing more than a long metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. There were no windows, no surveillance cameras, no chance of interruptions. It was a place for secrets. Admiral Marcus Thorne entered cautiously, the door closing behind him with a soft, metallic click that seemed to seal them off from the rest of the world. Lieutenant Eva Rostova stood at the far end of the room, her back turned to him, her hands resting on the edge of the table. "I haven't been in a room like this since my debrief," she said quietly, her voice echoing slightly off the bare white walls. "It's funny how certain places hold echoes of the past." The Admiral remained silent, his hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't sure what he was about to witness, but a deep, instinctual part of him knew that it would irrevocably change the way he viewed command, sacrifice, and the sanitized truths he had built his career upon. Eva turned around slowly. With a quiet, almost defiant calm, she began to unbutton her pristine dress blue uniform jacket. She folded it neatly and placed it over the back of a chair. Her white undershirt clung tightly to her skin, accentuating a frame that was lean and strong, but also carried a hidden fragility. With measured slowness, she raised the hem of the shirt just high enough to reveal the scarred landscape across her right side. Thorne took an involuntary step forward, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen combat injuries before, bullet wounds, burns, the clean lines of surgical repairs. But this was different. The scars were not clean or symmetrical. They were a brutal, twisted collage of torn flesh and discolored skin that told a story of battlefield medicine performed in the dirt and mud, a story of survival against impossible odds. Jagged lines of scar tissue crisscrossed her ribs, evidence of torn muscle and fractured bone. And just beneath her rib cage, two hard, raised lumps pressed against her skin, stark and unnatural. They were the unmistakable outlines of metal fragments, shrapnel that had been left embedded inside her for 2 long years. Eva dropped her shirt back down and, without a word, began to button her uniform jacket, her movements as precise and controlled as ever, as if she were merely reassembling her armor. The Admiral sat down slowly, his own hands trembling almost imperceptibly. "Why didn't they take them out?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper, the authority in it gone, replaced by something raw and human. "They're too close to my lung," she replied, her voice flat. "The surgeons said removing them would risk puncturing it. It was my choice to leave them in." He stared at her, trying to comprehend the reality of her words. "You live with that. Every single day." She gave a slight nod. "They ache when the weather changes. Sometimes during physical training. Most of the time, I forget they're even there until I see people clapping and giving me medals for it." Thorne leaned back in his chair, the weight of his own rank feeling suddenly hollow. The medals, the ceremony, the redacted file on his desk. All of it felt like a cheap imitation of the truth she carried inside her body. "I've seen my share of combat injuries, Lieutenant," he said slowly. "But that's different." "It's not just the scars, sir," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "It's what came after." Eva looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time since they had entered the room, he saw the full, unshielded depth of her anger and her pain. "After the extraction, I woke up in a military hospital in Guam. There was no command debrief. No one asked me what happened. There was just a nurse, a promotion to lieutenant, and orders to rest and recover. It was as if they wanted me to forget." Thorne's eyebrows rose in disbelief. "You weren't officially interviewed about the ambush." "Only once," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. "By a captain I'd never seen before. He asked me 3 questions, all from a script. Then he thanked me for my service and left. A week later, my commanding officer was recommending me for the Navy Cross." The Admiral clenched his jaw, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "That's not protocol. That's a cover-up." "No, sir," she corrected him, her words hitting him like a physical blow. "It's damage control." He leaned forward, the full weight of his position pressing down on him. "You're saying this entire incident was buried?" Eva nodded, her eyes like chips of ice. "Because someone in our own command made a catastrophic mistake, and they didn't want the real story to get out. They needed a hero to distract from the truth of what happened. They needed a story of courage under fire, not a story of betrayal." A long, tense pause filled the room. Thorne thought back to the mission orders, the satellite imagery, the intelligence briefings that had crossed his desk. At the time, everything had seemed routine, a low-risk extraction with no red flags. "How did you know it was a setup?" he asked, his voice low. "I didn't. Not at first," she admitted. "But then I saw the way the enemy moved, the way they had perfectly prepared their kill zone. They knew exactly where we would land and when we would land there. That kind of precision doesn't come from luck. It comes from information." He processed her words slowly, the implications spiraling outwards. "Did you report your suspicions?" Eva let out a small, Humorless laugh. Who was I going to tell, sir? The very people who signed the orders. That one cut deep, and Thorne knew it was meant to. I took the blame, she continued, her voice hardening. Not officially, of course. But my silence let the Navy spin the narrative they wanted. They needed a hero, so I gave them one. I kept my mouth shut to protect the men I saved, to protect the institution I still, for some reason, believe in. He considered her words, the immense burden she had carried alone. And the men you saved, he asked. They don't know the full truth, she said. They only know that I pulled them out of that hell. And for them, that has to be enough. Thorne leaned forward again, his voice now laced with a new intensity. Why tell me all of this now, after 2 years of silence? Because I saw the look in your eyes during that ceremony, Eva replied, her gaze unwavering. You looked at me like you wanted to know the real story, not just the one in the file. And because I'm tired, Admiral. I'm tired of pretending these scars are a symbol of glory when they're really just a reminder of survival. She paused, letting the silence in the room sit between them. I don't want medals for surviving a mission I was never meant to come back from. I want accountability. Admiral Thorne stood up and walked to the wall, his back to her. The weight of his career, of all the orders he had given and all the lives that had been affected by them, seemed to settle on his shoulders. I have spent my entire career thinking I understood what sacrifice looked like, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I have never had to live with pieces of a war physically embedded inside my body. I gave the orders. I trusted the system. He turned back to face her, his expression now one of grim determination. You believe there was a leak in the command chain, someone who fed the enemy our intelligence. I know there was, Eva said. Whether they're still active, I can't say. But someone sent us into that jungle knowing full well we wouldn't come out. Thorne gave a slow, deliberate nod. I can open a quiet, internal review. No promises on what I'll find, but I will look into it. I will find the truth. Eva stood as well, a flicker of something close to relief in her eyes. That's all I ask, sir. As she turned to leave, he stopped her with a final question. She looked back at him over her shoulder. Why did you keep serving after all of this, after the betrayal? She offered him a small, tired smile, the first genuine expression he had seen from her. Because the uniform didn't fail me, sir, she said. People did, and I'm not going to let them be the only ones wearing it. With that, she opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, her shoulders straight, her chin held high. The Admiral remained inside the sterile room, his eyes locked on the empty chair she had left behind. In that profound silence, he realized something that would change him forever. Some heroes don't need medals to be recognized. They just need to be heard. And he had finally listened. The next morning, Admiral Marcus Thorne sat alone in his expansive, wood-paneled office, the official file on Lieutenant Eva Rostova open on the mahogany desk in front of him. Dozens of pages filled with commendations, mission summaries, and promotion records lay neatly stacked, a comprehensive history of a brilliant career. Yet, none of it captured the raw, unyielding truth of the woman he had met the day before. Her scars told a more honest story than any official document ever could. She had turned the Navy's most prestigious awards ceremony into something deeply uncomfortable, not through protest or defiance, but through the quiet, unshakable power of her own truth. Thorne stared out the large window overlooking the bustling naval yard. Ships docked at the harbor, a carrier prepared for deployment, and the world outside moved on with clockwork precision, blissfully unaware of the secrets buried in classified files and the pieces of metal embedded in a soldier's body. He couldn't shake the look in Eva's eyes, the exhaustion and determination that coexisted there. It haunted him. He picked up the secure phone on his desk and made a call directly to the head of Naval Intelligence. I want a complete reevaluation of Operation Nightshade, he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Pull all internal communications from every level prior to the deployment. That includes classified and unclassified channels. I'll sign the executive override myself. The voice on the other end of the line paused, a moment of bureaucratic hesitation. Sir, that operation was officially closed 2 years ago, and the directive, I don't give a damn about the directives, Thor interrupted, his voice like cold steel. Reopen the case. Now. He slammed the phone down. Minutes later, his aide entered the office, his expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. Sir, Lieutenant Rostova is in the building. She came unannounced. Should I send her in? Before he could answer, Eva stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation, her uniform crisp, her expression as unreadable as ever. She rendered a salute, which the Admiral returned. She looked different today, more rested than she had at the ceremony, but her presence still carried an immense weight, as if she had never fully left the battlefield. I figured you might have more questions, sir, she said, her tone even. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I do. She sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a picture of perfect military composure. You said someone deliberately compromised your mission, he began, getting straight to the point. Eva nodded once. Yes, sir. Have you told anyone else your suspicions? No. If I had, I probably wouldn't still be in uniform, she replied, the statement delivered with a chilling matter-of-factness. Thorne's brows lifted slightly. You think it would have gone that far? Eva looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unflinching. If someone was willing to sacrifice 6 American lives for reasons unknown, what do you think they would do to the one person who survived and was willing to talk about it? The Admiral didn't respond immediately. He knew she was right. The world outside the service saw war in terms of strategy and bravery, of good versus evil. But inside, among the highest ranks, there were shadows, operations sanctioned under questionable ethics, mistakes covered up for political expediency, careers buried to protect a flawed system. It was rare, but it happened. And when it did, soldiers like Eva were the ones left to carry the silent burden of the truth. You believe there was a leak. Do you have any idea who it might have been? He asked. Eva shook her head. Not a name, but I have theories. It had to be someone embedded high enough in the command chain to redirect satellite data and override on-the-ground delay protocols without raising red flags. Thorne pulled a folder from his drawer and slid it across the desk toward her. I reopened the mission record this morning, he said. Within the original intelligence briefings, there's a timestamp anomaly. An intercepted distress signal from the target area came in 40 minutes before your team was scheduled to deploy. Eva blinked, the first crack in her composure. 40 minutes before. Yes, but the file was backdated. It was buried under a mountain of irrelevant data. I never saw it at the time. Someone changed the time logs and greenlit the mission despite knowing you would be walking directly into an ambush. She leaned back in her chair, her jaw tight, and they almost got away with it. Thorne looked down at the folder again, a grim expression on his face. There's more, he said. Your mission wasn't just an extraction. The scientist you were sent to rescue, Dr. Eris Thorne, was already dead when your team hit the ground. He had been for at least 12 hours. Eva stared at him, her eyes narrowing. That was not in our briefing. Exactly, the Admiral said, his voice low, because it was never supposed to be a rescue mission. It was a test run for a new satellite-guided drone targeting system. Your team was the control variable, the bait, and someone in command decided to run the test live. The words hit Eva like a physical blow. They used us as guinea pigs. Yes, he said quietly. The silence in the room was thick with the weight of betrayal. They sacrificed my entire team for a weapons test, she whispered, the words filled with a cold fury. Thorne nodded grimly. And they covered it up by painting you as a hero. They either knew you would survive or hoped you wouldn't. Either way, they would have gained narrative control over the entire incident. Eva stood up and began pacing, her hands balled into tight fists. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have pushed harder. You did what you could to protect your team, he said firmly, his voice filled with a newfound respect. You stayed silent to shield them from being dragged through years of hearings, to protect the Navy's image. That's not weakness, Lieutenant. That's leadership. Eva stopped pacing and turned to face him. So what happens now? I'm escalating this to the Inspector General, Thorne said, his tone resolute. It won't be public, not yet, but someone will answer for this. She sat down again, calmer now, but the fire still burned in her eyes. And what about the truth? Will it ever come out? Thorne gave her a long, steady look. Truth is like pressure, Lieutenant. You can keep it contained for a while, but eventually it bursts through. Eva gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then I'll wait. He glanced toward her side, a silent acknowledgement of the scars hidden beneath her uniform. How is the pain? She offered a slight, knowing smirk. It's always there, sir, but today it hurts a little less. Thorne allowed himself something unexpected, a smile. There's one last thing, he said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small, velvet-lined box, one that looked different from the standard-issue metal cases. Eva frowned. What's this? He opened it. Inside, resting on the velvet, was a simple, sharp, silver emblem, a single, unblinking star. The Integrity Star, he said. I had it drafted this morning. There's only one in existence. It's not for battlefield courage. It's for those who choose the harder truth over the easier lie. He stood, walked around the desk, and pinned it to her chest just above the Navy cross. There were no cameras, no ceremony, no applause. Just a quiet moment of profound respect. And in that moment, the Admiral finally saw her not as a myth, not as a headline, but as the soldier who came back when she wasn't supposed to and still found the courage to speak the truth. The hallway outside Admiral Thorne's office was quiet, but Lieutenant Eva Rostova could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears like a drum. She had always believed that the body remembered pain, even long after the mind tried to forget. Today had proven it. The simple silver Integrity Star on her chest felt heavier than the Navy Cross, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it represented: acknowledgement. For the first time in 2 years, she hadn't been reduced to a commendation or a decorated statistic. The Admiral had truly seen her. Still, the past didn't simply vanish just because someone finally listened. As she walked toward the base infirmary for a scheduled scan of the shrapnel in her side, she passed a group of junior officers whispering behind their coffee mugs. That's her, one of them murmured, his voice just loud enough to carry. The one from the jungle op. Eva didn't react. She had grown accustomed to being a ghost in uniform, a figure too real for rumor, but too legendary for comfort. Her scars, invisible beneath the starched fabric of her jacket, still defined her story in ways words never could. But something had undeniably shifted. Later that afternoon, Admiral Thorne called a private, unscheduled gathering in a classified conference room deep within the Naval Command building. 5 high-ranking officers were present, representing naval intelligence, the JAG Corps, and the Office of the Inspector General. Eva sat at the end of the long, polished table, her posture calm, but every sense on high alert. The Admiral stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding the room. Everyone in this room has the highest level of clearance and a vested interest in the integrity of this institution. He began, his voice low and serious. What we discuss today does not leave these walls until it is time. He then turned his gaze to Eva. Lieutenant, please proceed. She stood, and without hesitation, unbuttoned her uniform jacket. Once more, she lifted her undershirt to reveal the brutal map of scars across her side. A stunned silence fell over the room. One officer's eyes widened in shock. Another visibly winced. A third simply looked away, unable to meet the raw evidence of what she had endured. These are shrapnel wounds, she said, her voice steady and clear, sustained during Operation Nightshade. 2 of the fragments are still embedded in my body. The rest were removed by a field medic under heavy fire. We were deployed with no warning of an impending ambush, no backup, and no preemptive strike capabilities. She lowered her shirt and slowly buttoned her jacket, her movements deliberate, forcing them to watch, to acknowledge. I was told the mission was a simple extraction, she continued. But we now know it was a cover for a live weapons test, with my team deliberately used as bait. The JAG officer, a commander named Darnell, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We've reviewed the preliminary findings from the Admiral's inquiry, he said, his voice strained. A timestamp tampering on incoming intelligence has been confirmed. There is evidence that a critical data feed was rerouted through a private contractor connected to a defense technology firm, Orion Systems. Eva nodded. Orion. That's the name I saw on the satellite logs we were given. They were subcontracted to test a new thermal guidance drone protocol. But the drones never arrived to provide you with support. Another officer interjected, confused. They were never supposed to. Admiral Thorne replied, his voice grim. The point wasn't a successful rescue. The point was to observe our team's movements in real time against superior guerrilla ambush tactics, to see if a predictive algorithm could accurately recreate their path under extreme duress. The revelation hit the room like a physical detonation. So they sent real soldiers into hostile territory just to collect movement data. Darnell asked, his voice filled with stunned disbelief. Yes, Eva answered, her tone cold. And when we were attacked, they let it play out. The Inspector General's representative, a thin, sharp-eyed woman named Holborn, leaned forward. This is more than enough to open a full criminal investigation. Potential charges could include unauthorized covert operations, falsification of federal records, and negligent homicide. Admiral Thorne folded his arms across his chest. We are not burying this. No, sir, Holborn agreed. But we will need a formal, on-the-record statement from Lieutenant Rostova. Eva took a deep breath. For years, she had imagined this moment, the moment when she would finally be able to speak the full truth without fear of reprisal or being dismissed. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a long, slow exhale. I will give you my statement, she said. A sense of grim seriousness settled over the room as everyone nodded. As they stood to leave, one of the officers, a commander named Rizzo, approached her quietly. I serve in Hellman, he said, his voice low. I lost good men to a bad command call, but I never had the guts to say what you just did. Eva met his eyes. You still can. He offered a faint, sad smile. Maybe now I will. Outside, the sky had darkened. Storm clouds rolled in over the capital, casting long, ominous shadows across the base. Eva walked alone toward the barracks, the air thick with the promise of rain. Halfway there, she felt a familiar, dull twinge in her side. The shrapnel, dormant for days, was reminding her that it was still there. She stopped, placing her hand lightly over her ribs. It still hurt, but today the pain felt different. It felt less like a wound and more like a weapon. That night, she stood in front of the small mirror in her room, her shirt off, the room lit only by the dim bedside lamp. She studied the marks on her skin. The scars were still jagged, still raw in places, but they were no longer symbols of a silence she was forced to keep. They were evidence. And now, they were finally speaking. The early morning sun poured through the tall glass windows of the Naval Review Board's secure conference chamber, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Admiral Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the long table once again, flanked this time by higher-ranking officers, stoic legal advisors, and civilian defense liaisons. The atmosphere had shifted since Eva's private reveal. The mood was no longer just professional. It was combative. Across from him sat Vice Admiral Penrose, a man who had overseen procurement contract for the South Pacific region during the time of Operation Nightshade. He was known for his political connections and his ability to make problems disappear. I fail to see the purpose of revisiting a closed file from 2 years ago, Marcus, Penrose said flatly, his tone laced with impatience. The purpose, Thorne answered, his voice calm but firm, is accountability. Lieutenant Eva Rostova entered the room just as he finished speaking. She was dressed in her formal blues, her ribbon bar perfectly aligned, her chin held high. She was no longer just the survivor of a botched mission. She was the whistleblower, the living embodiment of a truth the Navy had tried to bury. Penrose narrowed his eyes as she took her seat. Lieutenant Rostova, I've had the chance to review your field file. What you and your team endured was unfortunate, but wartime missions carry inherent risks. Eva stood, placing her hands on the back of her chair. With all due respect, sir, what we faced wasn't war. It was betrayal. The words cut through the room's tense atmosphere like a razor. The mission I led into that jungle was not compromised by accident, she continued, her voice unwavering. The coordinates we received were accurate to the last decimal, but not for a rescue operation. They placed us directly into a pre-established enemy kill zone. The enemy knew we were coming because someone on our side told them. Murmurs circled the room. Some officers leaned forward, intrigued. Others sat perfectly still, their silence louder than any words. And how can you be so certain of such a serious accusation? Penrose challenged, his voice dripping with skepticism. Eva reached into her file and handed out 3 printed documents. Decrypted satellite path records, timestamp log from the contractor Orion Systems, and a classified internal memo she wasn't supposed to have access to. This, she said, pointing to the memo, is a transmission between Orion Systems and a Navy data relay contractor. It contains a field ID that matches my team's mission code. It was sent 11 hours before our deployment, long before any of us hit the ground. Penrose examined the document, his expression hardening. "You are not cleared to access these files, Lieutenant." "I know," she said without flinching, "but I had to show you the truth." His tone grew colder. "That is a severe violation of security protocol." Admiral Thorne interjected before he could continue. "You're focusing on our clearance, Admiral, when you should be focused on the content of that memo. This confirms our worst fear, that the mission was manipulated from within our own command structure." Eva nodded. "And that's not all." She placed a photograph on the table. It was blurry, taken by a drone long before the mission launched, but the image was recognizable. A group of insurgents unloading crates from a small boat marked with the Orion Security Subcontractor logo. "The enemy received our technology," Eva stated, her voice like ice. "Directly or indirectly, Orion Systems trafficked sensitive material into a hostile zone, and then they used my team to test their experimental targeting model on their new business partners." Someone in the room swore under their breath. Another officer stood up and left the room, clearly rattled. Admiral Thorne closed his folder with a decisive snap. "The United States Navy will not be used as a testing ground for private industry profits. Not on my watch. This isn't just sabotage, it's treason." Vice Admiral Penrose adjusted his collar, his composure finally cracking. "These are very serious accusations, not verdicts." "Then let's find out the truth," Thorne countered. "I have already initiated a joint investigation with the Department of Defense and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. A formal inquiry will begin tomorrow. You will be called to testify." Penrose stiffened, his face turning a shade paler. "You're overstepping your command, Marcus." Eva leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "No, sir. For the first time, we're finally doing what command is supposed to do: protect its people." The room fell into an uneasy silence. The tide had irrevocably turned. That evening, Eva sat alone on a park bench overlooking the Potomac River as it shimmered beneath the fading gold of twilight. The air was cooler now, crisp and clean. It felt like the first full breath she had taken in a long, long time. She heard a voice behind her. "You should have been a lawyer, Lieutenant." Admiral Thorne approached and sat beside her, a cup of coffee in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. Eva chuckled, a rare, genuine sound. "I've had a lot of practice arguing with walls." He handed her the envelope. She opened it carefully. Inside was an official letter on Navy letterhead, her name at the top, and a single word printed in bold: "Cleared." "I filed an early immunity motion on your behalf," he explained, "for accessing the classified files. You won't face any charges." She blinked, stunned. "You didn't have to do that, sir." "Yes, I did," he said firmly. "You protected the integrity of this uniform more fiercely than most people who wear it their whole lives." She stared out at the river. "I thought if I told the truth, they would silence me for good." "They tried," he said, "but he made sure your scars spoke louder than their secrets." He stood to leave, but paused. "You're not done yet, you know." Eva looked up at him. "Meaning, after all this, people are going to look at you differently. Some will hate you for disrupting the system. Some will admire you, but most will follow your lead. You have more to teach them than just combat tactics." She didn't respond right away. Finally, she asked, "What if I'm not ready for that?" "You are," Thorne said with absolute certainty. "Because you didn't survive to be silent. You survived to lead." He walked away, leaving Eva holding the letter and something far heavier, a new sense of purpose. Weeks passed, and the storm Eva had set in motion was no longer contained behind the closed doors of secure conference rooms. The internal investigation made headlines across defense and political channels. The boardroom of Orion Systems trembled under federal pressure, and two senior Navy officers, including Vice Admiral Penrose, were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the inquiry. The scandal now had a name: the Nightshade Conspiracy. Eva had become an unlikely symbol, not just of survival, but of a long overdue reckoning. One morning, as she arrived at the naval base, she noticed a small group of young cadets standing outside the officers' mess. They straightened up when they saw her approach. One of them, a woman barely 20 years old, offered a crisp, respectful salute. "Ma'am," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "Just wanted to say thank you for not letting them bury the truth." Eva nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She was slowly getting used to being thanked for surviving something she had never volunteered to endure. Inside the command building, the Admiral's assistant handed her a sealed folder. "Admiral Thorne said you are cleared to review this personally," the assistant informed her. She opened it and found something completely unexpected: a redeployment request for her. It wasn't a combat assignment, nor was it punitive. It was an advisory role attached to a new, classified reform task force designed to audit all missions related to advanced defense contractors. She would act as the field-level voice among the policymakers. She would have rank, influence, and the power to prevent another Nightshade from ever happening again. Eva sat down slowly in a nearby chair. She wasn't being sidelined or silenced. She was being elevated. But was she ready to carry this fight into the very heart of the system itself? Later that afternoon, Eva walked into Admiral Thorne's office. He stood at the window, reading a memo. Without turning around, he spoke. "Knew you'd come. You want me to help fix the system?" she asked, the folder clutched in her hand. He finally turned to face her. "No, Lieutenant. I want you to help us rebuild it." Eva glanced down at the folder again. "That system is the reason I have shrapnel in my side. It almost killed me." "That," the Admiral said with a grim certainty, "is precisely why it needs someone who survived it." She hesitated for a moment. "What if they don't listen to me?" "They will," he said. "Because if they don't, you'll make sure they do." That night, Eva visited an old friend, Sergeant Malik Bennett. He was one of the other survivors from her team during Operation Nightshade. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year. He met her outside a small veteran center near the base. His limp was more pronounced now, and the burn scars on his hand hadn't faded, but his eyes still held a fierce fire. "I saw the hearings on the news," he said, his voice rough. "You were a force of nature." Eva smiled softly. "I wish we had all made it back." Malik nodded, his expression somber. "I do too. But you made sure their sacrifice meant something. That's more than I could have ever hoped for." She handed him a copy of her official statement to the Inspector General. "It's all in here. Every lie, every thread of the cover-up." He took it gently, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "Do you still carry the guilt?" he asked. "Every single day," she admitted. He leaned back, looking up at the stars. "Then carry it like armor. You're the reason they'll think twice before they sacrifice another team for the sake of an algorithm." They sat together in silence for a while, not the painful, awkward kind, but the comfortable silence of two people who had walked through hell together and needed no words to understand each other's pain. The next week, Eva boarded a plane bound for Washington, D.C. Her destination, the Pentagon. She was met by the Secretary of Defense, Langston, who had personally requested her presence on a new strategic panel. Unlike most officials she had met, Langston was direct and to the point. "We have created an entire combat doctrine around our partnerships with the tech industry. That's not the issue," he said as they walked through the hallowed halls. "The issue is letting those partnerships override human judgment and moral responsibility. We need fail-safes, and we need war fighters like you shaping them." Eva didn't respond immediately. Langston continued, "They'll tell you that policy isn't personal, but you and I both know that it always is." Eva looked him straight in the eye. "Then let's make it personal for the right reasons." The first meeting was tense. Generals, engineers, contractors, and lobbyists, the very people who made decisions from behind screens and spreadsheets, were now sitting across from the woman whose scars testified to their failures. One executive from a rival defense firm cleared his throat. Lieutenant Rostova, with all due respect, war is unpredictable. Collateral risk is an inherent part of the calculus. Eva's stare didn't flinch. You call it calculus. I call it spending 3 days on a jungle floor watching my teammates bleed out because a drone feed wasn't optimized yet. The room fell silent. She pushed forward, her voice gaining strength. You want better algorithms. Fine, but stop treating soldiers like variables in your equations. Someone in the back whispered, she's not wrong. The shift was beginning. In the evenings, Eva would return to her hotel room, exhausted but unwavering. Her ribs still ached, especially in the cold DC air. She would trace the lines of her scars while reviewing new policy proposals, this time not as the subject of another failed mission, but as the force reshaping future ones. She still woke sometimes from old dreams, gunfire, smoke, Malik shouting her name. But now, when she woke, she reached for her tablet, not her pistol. This fight wasn't over, but it was hers now, and she was finally winning. 6 months later, the Pentagon's newly established Joint Ethics and Field Innovation Council released its first set of operational policy reforms. Embedded within them was the Rostova Clause, a mandatory field agent review process that gave experienced service members the power to halt or amend contractor-led missions if the assessed risk exceeded live combat thresholds. Eva's name was on every memo. The reforms were sweeping. Private defense firms now had to submit real-time operational transparency logs to a military oversight committee. Whistleblower protections for field officers were significantly expanded. But the real shift came in the culture. Soldiers now had a voice inside the rooms where decisions were once made without them. Eva, once just a lieutenant with a haunted past, was now a senior military advisor, one of the youngest ever to serve in such a role. She still wore the uniform, not for rank, but for principle. One evening, after a long debriefing with NATO allies, Eva stood alone in a Pentagon hallway, staring at a digital display of fallen heroes. Her fingers hovered over the photograph of her old team. She whispered each of their names: Walker, Diaz, Franks, Kim, Reeves. They were more than data points, more than operational losses. They were the reason she had never given up. Hey, came a voice behind her. It was Admiral Thorne. He had aged in those 6 months. The lines around his eyes were deeper, his hair grayer, but his presence remained as immovable as ever. I heard the NATO brief went well, he said. Eva nodded. They listened. That's all you ever wanted. She smiled. No, sir. I wanted them to understand. He stepped beside her and looked at the wall of names. You gave them something they could never deny, a truth no one could explain away. Eva looked down, a wave of emotion washing over her. I thought I would feel lighter after all of this was over. You won, he reminded her. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Winning doesn't bring them back. No, he said gently, but it keeps others from joining them too soon. Months later, Eva was invited to speak at the U.S. Naval Academy. The auditorium was packed. Rows of young cadets in crisp uniforms waited, whispering to each other as she stepped up to the podium. She didn't open with a prepared speech. Instead, she looked out at their eager, hopeful faces and said, "You will hear a lot about glory. You will hear about sacrifice. But what they won't always tell you is how to survive what you lose, and how to speak when you are told to stay silent." The crowd quieted. She slowly raised her left hand and placed it over the scarred side of her ribs. This, she said, her voice ringing with truth, was meant to be forgotten, but became the loudest part of my story. Her voice didn't shake. I stand here today not because I was the strongest, but because I refused to walk away knowing I had a voice that others didn't. You won't always be believed, but speak anyway. The ones who matter will hear you. A profound silence filled the hall, and then came thunderous applause. That night, dozens of young cadets came up to her, asking how to lead, how to fight injustice, how to endure when they felt alone. Eva didn't offer them perfect answers. She offered them her honesty. And sometimes that was enough. In the months that followed, her scars became a symbol, not of pain, but of power. She was featured in military publications, on defense panels, and even at civilian conferences on ethics in AI warfare. Not for fame, but for impact. She still visited the Veterans Hospital once a week, bringing chessboards and poetry books to recovering soldiers. One day, a young amputee asked her, "Do you ever feel like you didn't make it back whole?" Eva answered gently, "I didn't, but what I brought back was more useful than the pieces I lost." On the anniversary of Operation Nightshade, she returned to the jungle with Malik Bennett and a small team of memorial staff. The old battle site had changed, overgrown and reclaimed by nature, but the echo of loss was still there. They planted a flag and said the names of their fallen teammates aloud. When it was done, Malik turned to her. "Think you'll ever stop fighting?" Eva shook her head. "Not while there's still someone out there who thinks silence is safer than the truth." A year to the day since she stood in front of Admiral Thorne and raised her shirt to show him her scars, a bronze plaque was mounted at the Naval History Museum. It read, "She spoke when silence was demanded. She stood when others fell. And she bore her scars not as wounds, but as warnings that saved countless more." Her name was engraved below. And somewhere far from the policy rooms and the hallowed halls of Washington, somewhere in a jungle that once tried to bury her, a single flag waved above the treetops, defiantly unbroken. Eva Rostova had survived, and the world would never forget why.